Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karen Messina and Dr. Felicia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. I'm Karen Messina, the host of this show, along with our wonderful co-host, Felicia Powell-Williams. And I'm so glad, and we're all fortunate to have her. Today, we're going to talk about holidays and how cultural exclusion operates during many major holiday seasons. What we're going to be talking about is the dominant culture or religious calendar that creates othering and how the collective psychic defenses resist integration of familiar traditions. It's like, well, one person does one thing, and it's like the other is not so good because of it. It can be very subtle.
Doesn't have to necessarily be so subtle, but what's really important right here is for us from a psychoanalytic perspective, how the seasonal calendar acts as a really powerful collective superego. And so one might think that in that way, it will dictate what is good and what is normal and, what's really worthy, of public acknowledgement. So with that being said, it's like it's sanctioning, and you were getting to that, it's sanctioning various events and the acceptable symbols and the legitimate narratives of joy and celebration. So I think that moving in that direction and just kind of exploring that today may be really important in how we think about it and what comes out of our own discussion with it.
No, I absolutely agree with everything that you said. And again, from a psychoanalytic perspective, we might think of the good object calendar. Some holidays become those that sort of are. I mean, say a Christmas tree or gift giving. Everybody doesn't do that, and we fail to recognize it. And it's so all encompassing, like stores. They have sales on the 26th because or returns, Christmas returns, but it's in the news, it's all over. And yet other people don't do the same things. They don't have the same traditions. So it's, again, the good object calendar is not necessarily, I don't think, where we want to go ultimately.
Well, Karen, everything that falls outside of that sanctioned experience, from Diwali or Hanukkah to even Kwanzaa, any secular Yule observance is regulated to the status of a bad object calendar.
Very, very good point.
Yeah. So when we look at both ends, the good and the bad, these are the celebrations that require more of an explanation. They're not as visible, they're kind of in the fine print on an event calendar, so the public really has to go and maybe even Google it to figure out, what is this all about? I'm hearing about it and wanting to respect it. But even that risk of being treated as a deviation from the norm is definitely there. I take into account also, Karen, as you were speaking, I thought about the calendar itself seems to extend to the good enough or the good object, so to speak, even into, I would say, August. Maybe it was August when they started putting out, Halloween. Or it may have been July. July may have been the time they started putting out Halloween decorations. And as we see each year, that there's also the celebration of many of these particular holidays much earlier than usual. And so there's something about that too, as we tend to think about what is it that we are holding and how much of that comes from those very endearing memories, those things that we hold really dear to us, but then also about in the othering, the things that don't feel good, things that we don't know about, things that tend to threaten or overshadow what might feel good or be good.
That just brought to mind something that I've heard something like this a lot from well-intentioned people. They'll say things like, "Oh yeah, that holiday, X holiday, it's like ours, but it's smaller." Well, that's minimizing, and I don't think these people, there's a couple of people I have in mind, are intending to offend anybody, but like ours, but smaller, that it seems to diminish other holidays that many people here in this country don't celebrate, but we should honor other people's tradition because
Mhm.
they're just as important to them as some of our holidays are to us. So they should have equal status.
That's right.
So then defense mechanisms kick in.
What comes to mind for you?
Well, there's a manic defense. I think
Yes.
people just run around buying all these gifts, returning all these gifts, but I don't think that they pause to stop and think about the feelings that are emerging from all of this. It's just we've got to do, bye, 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 bye. Maybe take back, take back. But it's I mean, at least a number of people aren't, I don't think, stopping to really process what's going on and how in all of this they are excluding quite a few people, the percentage of people who are not Christian in this country who do not celebrate Christmas, for example.
Exactly. I wanted to go back to something, and that is as we think about othering, because you're bringing up something that is so important, and how at moments we're not necessarily consciously thinking what's happening. And I always fall back um on Leary's concept with how we carry our loyalties, our traditions, our beliefs. All of those are really important. And oftentimes when we carry that, not that when we carry, but we do carry, in order to expand and begin to allow more in, there is something that we have to give up. There's some element of loss there that maybe perhaps is what you're talking about, because when we stop thinking, that's when we keep things very contained in a way in which there is no room to be inclusive. But when we allow ourselves to see that there's more than our own, and how we could begin to think about that and invite that in, that's really important. It's important as we're talking about holidays now, important for us to think about what would it be like if we were to invite the thoughts and the traditions and the beliefs in to learn about and engage, and to, you know, allow ourselves something that is outside of our own norm. And thinking about this, I just wanted to read this really quickly about othering, as we know that it is a process by which individuals or groups attribute negative characteristics to others and setting them apart as representing the opposite of what is seen as acceptable. And so when we put aside something that isn't seen as acceptable, what are we saying? And when we think about this from this holiday and we're looking at this calendar, what are we putting aside within ourselves?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. What are we putting aside? And what is occurring that we're not really facing?
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think anxiety of the unfamiliar is part of it. If we
Mhm.
are not familiar with something, there's a way to discount it. It's like I mentioned earlier, well, it's like ours, but smaller. But if you think of other things like unfamiliar traditions, maybe like Diwali lights in November, people aren't familiar with that, so they kind of stand back. I think they're afraid of it. So some people will put it down. Some people just shy away because they don't know anything about it. I think, and I've observed this myself. Um, uh, Eid, the celebration of, I have Pakistani people in my family. And when I say something about Eid, if I'm talking to, just say, somebody in the United States who doesn't really know about it, they just kind of look at me and sometimes they'll say, What is it that you said? What does that mean? And these are not, I don't think of these people as racist or bigoted. They just are unfamiliar, and that really creates a lot of anxiety.
Diwali is such a beautiful celebratory, experience that's there and it's meaningful. And even as we think about within the Black culture, the African American culture with Kwanzaa, if we look at this, the collective can stay and stay, with this high symbolic activity. You mentioned this earlier, the buying, the decorating, the partying. But to avoid the reality that, all these symbols are actively othering someone who observes Kwanzaa, or who's managing, grief or who simply doesn't participate in any of this. It's really important. But Kwanzaa is, the day after Christmas, the first day. And how oftentimes it is under the radar and it's not a holiday that is necessarily experienced. It's not necessarily a holiday that is discussed, and you don't hear much about what the meaning behind each one of those particular days. And so, how important it is for us to begin to think about that, but to think about it in a sense of, the othering. It's not familiar and it's not acceptable because it's not familiar.
Right. And going back to anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
I think that if one were to grapple with this, just say somebody realized that they were othering and didn't want to do that anymore, whether it's in therapy and or whether it's on their own. What would it entail to work on that? And I think it takes tolerating the anxiety of not knowing. If you just tolerating being with it until you can figure out, talk to somebody about what you're feeling, about how you maybe othered in the past and how you don't want to do that anymore. Get information about these holidays. You, of course, don't have to celebrate them, but know about them, respect them.
You're right. And perhaps as we think more about this right now, we're talking about even within our own internal experiences. And, as things start to surface and more consciously, how much of the uncomfortable, the unaccepted can we tend to tolerate and try to process and be with? And so again, we're falling back in this more psychoanalytic way of being able to hold something. It's like holding, the hot potato. How long can we hold it before we want to pass it on? Before we want to get rid of it because it carries too much heat, too much discomfort. It carries too much pain, too much uncertainty. And so we want to rid ourselves of that. And doing that doesn't necessarily mean that the potato doesn't exist, but it sure can be really comfortable in the moment, not having to consciously hold on to that and just really suppressing it, putting it away someplace, so it's not thought about. And I see that happening much in what we're exploring right now with things that are not familiar, things that are uncomfortable.
Right. Well, I always have to highlight projective identification
Please do so.
because it's so ever present and so many people sort of get caught in this trap of feeling uncomfortable about something and then pushing it off to someone else. It's these other people. It's not me. I celebrate this particular holiday, and this is really the main one to celebrate. Not, and I have some ideas about someone else's holiday, and that's just their thing. They just put it. You put the bad object, so to speak, not within themselves. They locate it elsewhere. So I think it's a form of projective identification.
Definitely, definitely. I understand where you're coming from with that. And that perspective, Karen, it's, you know, if we keep it in this other place, it helps to perform, as one might say, that their holiday in a way is more palatable and it's less threatening, to that dominant superego. So I hear where you're coming from with that. And then I wonder also when we were talking about Kwanzaa, I had brought that up a little earlier, Kwanzaa or even Hanukkah, and if someone is celebrating either one, it doesn't mirror the specific cheer or the aesthetic of the dominant season. It's often about looking at these various parts, over a period of time. And somebody may put that aside and say that it doesn't reflect what they're hoping to feel internally, what they're hoping to experience externally.
From a statistics standpoint, I looked this up and I think something like 63% of Americans identify as Christian. But that leaves roughly 37% of Americans who believe in other traditions. They're Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist. Maybe they're not affiliated with a religion at all, but that's a pretty high percentage that the in group just sort of uh, turns their head when they think about it. It's Christianity. That's the thing. That's where the action is. You certainly could be a Christian and respect other people, Jewish people, Muslims, um, Buddhists, and all their cultures and religions.
I'm thinking back when I was in school, and I'm very grateful to my parents who really gave me a wider lens culturally and looking at just the different celebrations within different cultures, within different races, and which made the holidays even more special to me growing up. because it was always, oh, let's celebrate this week, this week, or this particular day. It was so exciting to just know that there was so much joy that can be explored for me as a kid, and that it was seen from, I would say, from some of my friends when I would talk about it. Wow, what is this all about? We celebrate this one holiday and that's it. We're done. But to me, it meant so much more, and it was so much appreciated on my end that I had that opportunity, which a lot of people do not, but to have that inclusiveness, to allow more in, so that my belief system, my traditions, were not just limited to one way. And not that that one way is the wrong way, but for me, that felt important. Now, I remember also in school, as you're talking about this, and we are exploring the calendar, this holiday calendar. Everyone got time off. It was like 2 or 3 weeks off for Christmas.
Yeah.
And that everything was about the Christmas trees, the lights, Santa was coming. There was going to be all of these presents. But I had many friends who were Jewish, and their celebration, well, and their observance, excuse me, their observance of Hanukkah was not on the calendar.
Yeah.
And so when they took off, when my friends were not there, they were considered to have unexcused absences.
That's outrageous.
Yes. As I'm thinking about it in our discussion today, you know, that falls along the line of what we're discussing here.
Well, this reminds me of a term I heard lately, and maybe other people have heard it previously, but it's retail reality. Everybody's running to the store on the 26th, as I mentioned earlier. I think it's something like 19 or 20% of gifts are returned. But there's this manic standing in line. I guess it's also like Black Friday, but standing in line sometimes for hours to return things or get in on sales. But it's like after Christmas sales. If you don't celebrate Christmas, it must seem, I mean, maybe you want to go to the sales, but it must seem peculiar. So I think it's a manic defense against a greater integration of holidays.
Uh-huh. And then I want to also add to that, Karen, not necessarily if you're not celebrating Christmas, but it's how you might celebrate Christmas.
Yeah.
How might one think of the season from, a Christian point of view? It may not necessarily be about the shopping and all the gifts, but it could be that it is about the birth of Jesus Christ. It becomes about how might you celebrate it as well.
Absolutely. And that brings to mind there's a lot of trauma associated with the life of Jesus Christ. And yet, it's often not talked about. And I think that's some sort of manic defense again. Even for religious people, we can race out and get all these gifts and have a beautiful tree and a wonderful dinner and maybe not think about the trauma that is associated with something many people just want to think of as a wonderful thing.
Well, the word wonderful tends to be a part of this season. And what we tend to see is that as much as many of us want it to be a wonderful season, is that it doesn't necessarily feel that way. And it could be met with so much pain and so much trauma, so much loss and sadness, as we've mentioned earlier in our discussion. And that we try, so hard to make this a season that is filled with so much joy and laughter and contentment, and that oftentimes it doesn't seem that way.
I think part of this has to do with, again, a defense. Uh,
Mhm.
there's anxiety. If you really think about the tradition of Christmas, there would be a lot of anxiety involved. But if you can get caught up in all the busyness, and I love many things about Christmas myself, well, I also try to keep in mind that it wasn't this road that we're on was not all sunshine and roses for sure. A lot of trauma was uh, one can find along the road. And it's fine. We experience both, but just to
Yeah.
go towards everything's wonderful, that's when something is being walled off.
I think that we're talking about really true integration, and that true integration really means moving beyond the defensive posture.
Yeah.
And it really does require more of a collective to tolerate the complexity of a season that holds multiple sacred, narratives and things of that nature. And just really accepting the reality, accepting that reality that what's a good way of saying it, that, the national experience is the only whole when all its constituent parts are equally and visibly recognized. I think that, we have to get to a place of being able to receive what's there,
Absolutely.
being able to respect, and that's a part of the integration is that it may not be yours, but can we respect that it is there and that it means something and it has a meaning. That meaning could belong to anyone. That belief, that loyalty, that tradition, those belong somewhere. And can we embrace that without othering it?
I think you're spot on. So that might be a good place to conclude for today. But you hit the nail on the head, I think. If you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe.
Please
It's
do.
yeah, it's very helpful to do that. So thanks so much, and we'll be back soon.
Yes.